The great playwright Eugene O'Neill once said, "All we are is our past." Our modern world is forever changing, and there is little place for our past. But I hold it very dear because my mother, Gracienne Marie Dean, was so much a part of my past and a huge source of my inspiration. She provided a wonderful home life for me and my family, and she touched the lives of so many people who knew her. This is a tribute to my mother. Gracienne Marie Dean was born April 26, 1914, in Kitchener, Ontario, and she's standing second from the right between her stepfather, Carl Ruckel, and her mother, Sophia, with her brother Fred Dean on the left. Her grandparents, Ertel, are seated in the front. From a young age, my mom's grandmother sensed how musical she was and paid for her piano lessons, and every week my mom would roller skate to her lessons. When she was 16, she received her ARCT, which is the Associate of the Royal Conservatory, the highest academic standings awarded by the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. After finishing high school, my mom worked full-time as a secretary at an insurance company while teaching piano as well as singing after work. My father, Lester Shantz, took singing lessons from my mom and became enamored with her. On Valentine's Day, my dad proposed to my mom, giving her a box of chocolates with a card that said, "Give me a chance." Well, she did, and she became Gracienne Shantz when they married on June 26, 1942. On my mom's right are her parents, and on my dad's left are his parents, my grandma and grandpa Shantz. I remember my mom telling me how happy she was on her honeymoon. Having had a turbulent childhood when her mother and biological father, Robert Dean, divorced, my mom finally had security and stability that my dad provided, being brought up as a Mennonite, and the solid values his religion and family instilled in him. From 1942 to 1945, my dad went off to World War II in Europe. While at war, my oldest brother Jim was born in 1943. Then came my other brother Dave in 1946. And finally, a very chubby me in 1952. My parents had moved from Kitchener to East 11th Street in Hamilton, Ontario. My dad started out as a teacher, then later became a school principal. My mom started with a few music students by going door to door, telling people she taught piano and singing. This is Herman, our dachshund, who had his picture in the Hamilton Spectator newspaper while eyeing the hydrant and the RCA Victor dog. He always hoped for a free handout. On New Year's Eve, my mum sings Auld Lang Syne with our good friends Agnes and Tom Mack on her left. Out west in Banff, my mom, Dave, Aunt Hazel, and cousin John posed with some First Nations people. Later, my mom did an oil painting of a very dignified First Nations chief. When we were young, summer holidays were at Long Point Beach on Lake Erie, where we'd rent a cottage and spend the summer flopping around in the lake and playing badminton. Our good friends, the Macks, would rent a cottage near us, and Tom would take our families fishing. In the photo, I'm in the middle with a big catch of the day with my good pal, Carol Mack. Here my parents and I are taking a tour of Quebec City in a horse-drawn carriage, relishing the French culture. This is in 1968 when my parents, Dave and I, were in Europe, standing in front of the Berlin Wall. At that time, it would have seemed unthinkable for the wall to come down in 20 years' time. In 1969, my parents and I, on the left, flew with Agnes, Valerie, and Carol Mack on the right to Europe. Valerie's taking the photo. My brother Dave met up with us in Paris. He was working in Germany at the time. In 1976, my parents, together with Tom and Agnes Mack, met up with me in England, where I was studying at the time. You can see they're enjoying a pint. Here my mum and Agnes are checking out the guard at Buckingham Palace. On the same trip, my parents and I, together with Tom and Agnes, stayed at a beautiful pension that was situated on Lake Annecy in France. Here my mum is standing while I'm feeding the swans. Annecy isn't far from the Swiss border, and one day we took the gondola up Mont Blanc in Switzerland, with my parents enjoying the mountain air. I have my mum to thank for all these trips and for my love of travel and overseas adventure. On November 11th, 1978, my parents are standing with my brother Dave just before his wedding ceremony with Candy. In 1979, my husband, Jack Schumacher, and I were at my parents' place in Florida. This was the first time my parents met Jack, who was on very good behavior. In June 1982, my parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Across the back row, standing from right to left, is my husband Jack, then my oldest brother Jim and his wife Nancy. In the front are their children, Ryan and Aaron. My parents' other grandchild is Dave and Candy's son, Paul, who is riding high in the saddle. My mum was a very good artist and filled our home with many of her oil paintings, like the two hanging on the wall done in an Oriental style. And here are a few other examples of her artwork. My mum had an exceptional ability as a pianist. I can't help thinking that, with all her talent, she must have felt torn, like the proverbial elephant in Eastern literature that tugs at its chain on lonely nights. We are all part of our cultural constraints and captives of our present time. Many women of my mum's generation stayed home to raise the children without venturing into the world for a career. When my parents moved to Hamilton, they joined Mount Hamilton Baptist Church. Even though my mom couldn't have a career as a concert pianist, her religious faith was all important to her, allowing her to fulfill her talent through other outlets, such as church organist and choir director. She also inspired her multitude of piano and singing students throughout her whole life, teaching at home after school. She never stopped learning. In her early 50s, she took time out of a hectic week to drive to the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto to advance her knowledge in piano and teaching skills. But she'd always make sure she was home by the time I'd walk in the door after school, which was reassuring for me. In the background, you can hear my mom playing the accompaniment to the song Die Schönen Trompeten Blasen, which translated means Where the Fair Trumpets Sound by the composer Gustav Mahler. The singer is Colleen Morrison, who, as a very gifted student, received her ARCT, Associate of the Royal Conservatory of Music of Toronto, while studying with my mum. Colleen's appearance was very petite, and whenever she'd sing, people's mouths would drop when they heard her beautiful, rich, booming voice. Later, after lessons with Canada's great contralto Maureen Forrester and Bernard Diamant, who taught Maureen Forrester, Colleen set out on her own concert tours for several years, with my mum as her accompanist and me as the page turner. As a child, I was itching to start piano lessons, and when I was 5 years old, my mum started me off. But it came with a price. Practice. When I heard my friends playing outside, there would be tears since I wanted to join them but had to sit at the piano and serve my time. As always, my mum would get a tissue to wipe my tears and one for herself, being upset if I cried. In 1963, realizing she could take me only so far, my mum drove me regularly to the Royal Conservatory in Toronto, where I had a scholarship to study piano under the eminent Earl Moss. This picture is me playing in the concert hall of the Royal Conservatory with my nose to the piano. While studying with Mr. Moss, I passed the ARCT and licentiate of the Royal Schools of Music. There were also music festivals in Ontario and Quebec that Colleen and I participated in, with my mum cheering us on. In 1968, my mum was Colleen's accompanist, as Colleen and I studied at the Mozarteum in Salzburg, Austria, for the summer enjoying the sounds of music. Then after high school, I obtained the licentiate of the Royal Academy of Music while studying piano and composition at the Royal Academy in London, England. I went as far as I did because of my mum. She ingrained a strong sense of self-discipline that has stayed with me all my life. By harnessing and molding my musical ability, she helped shape me into the musician I am today. As the years went by, I turned my musical interest to composition. Enchanted by the beauty of folk music, my compositions for piano as well as orchestra became a blend of folk and classical music. I was lucky to have some of my orchestral compositions performed by live orchestras. My mum was always this colorful, free-spirited, animated person who loved life and was fearless when it came to talking to important musicians to further the careers of myself and Colleen, and for standing up for what she believed was right. Sadly, in 1977, my mum was stricken with Alzheimer's disease and was unable to rage against the dying of the light. But amidst it all, the Alzheimer's did not wipe away her musical self. People were amazed that she could still play the piano. So all in all, she did not go too gentle into that good night. In this photo, my mother is celebrating one of her birthdays. This last picture celebrates not only that birthday, but also her life in which she gave so much to me and those who knew her.